Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the nature of Psi, PSI, the term used by parapsychologists and psychical researchers to define the various subjects that they study. And with me is Dr. Vernon Neppe, a neuropsychiatrist, head of the Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute in Seattle, author of several books, including Reality Begins with Consciousness, and Cry, the Beloved Mind, and also a whole trilogy, in fact more than a trilogy of books on déjà vu. Welcome again, Vernon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
It's a pleasure once again to be with you. We've had several conversations now, and we're beginning to move into the area of theory, because by the very use of a term psi to cover a wide range of phenomena, parapsychologists seem to be suggesting an underlying principle or mechanism even covering all of these, and that's what we'll be focusing in on now.
Thank you so much.
Let's begin by just sort of talking about the data itself. There are half a dozen or more different research paradigms in parapsychology, all of which have achieved very significant statistical results.
That is true.
For example, remote viewing.
Yeah, remote viewing would be one example, and data pertaining to random number generators would be another.
Now let's talk about a random number generator for a moment. It's typically a quantum mechanical device. It's truly random, unpredictable, and experiments are done in which people are asked to predict or control the outcome.
That is true, yes.
Yeah.
And when you start looking at that data, and you start looking at the data, for example, in remote viewing, you find a certain commonality in terms of that thread. You find that if you statistically analyze the good, solid research, and I must tell you that research in the discipline of parapsychology, which I see as part of this broader area of consciousness research, might include other things, for example, genius and other kinds of ideas. Research in the area of parapsychology is so detailed and so careful that, in a way, every single student in a bachelor's degree in science ought to be taught the methodology that has been applied to parapsychological research, the stringencies, making sure that everything is covered, that there is no area of leakage from the senses, from the eyes and the ears and the smell and the taste and the touch, for example.
Yeah.
And from the motor senses in terms of muscle manipulation of any kind, or even manipulation now of electronic instrumentation. It's a fantastically detailed area from the point of view of research. And when aspects such as remote viewing demonstrate statistics against chance, we're talking about what's called frequentist statistics, the usual kind of statistics that we are taught in psychology, that we are taught in even the harder sciences such as physics, of 1 in a billion or more against chance. We call these 6 sigma data because when you analyze it, it's like 6 standard deviations away from the norm. We say, what's going on? Got that in the remote viewing. You've got that with random number generators. We've got it with the Global Consciousness Project.
Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah.
How the Global Consciousness Project is also based on these random number or random event generators, quantum mechanical devices, but they're, in this case, scattered all over the world. The researcher, the principal researcher, our friend Roger Nelson, calls them eggs. And what he finds is that when there are significant events that attract the attention of millions or even billions of people, the death of Princess Diana and her funeral, or the elections or great sporting events where 1 billion people are watching, that there's a certain coherence that appears in, you could say, the quantum mechanical foam that underlies reality, and it shows up in these random event generators.
Truly remarkable, and again, more than 1 in 1 billion against chance.
Yeah.
6 Sigma, amazing. And then you can throw around other things, like the BIM Protocol from Daryl Bem.
Daryl Bem, the Cornell psychologist who has done a whole series of conventional psychological experiments, but he added a twist in which the effect comes before the stimulus that produces it. Let me put it, yes, that's right. The stimulus follows the effect rather than precedes the effect. In other words, the stimulus seems to be operating in a reverse direction in time.
And that's amazing. And yet, you look at presentiment, which relates
another
again to
research
time.
paradigm. So we've got about half a dozen or more research paradigms with dozens of experiments in each of them, producing significant results. And you raised one point earlier that you talked about the rigor with which this research is done. Conventionally, people surmise that these researchers must be idiots or shoddy researchers or fools. But when you look at it carefully, what you find, what you've just said, is their research is more rigorous on average than typical research in science.
You use the phrase on average. You're talking about several standard deviations in a way, a joke, but more rigorous. It's far, far more rigorous than anything that is around. When we look at pharmaceutical drug studies, for example, I might match it for age and sex and maybe weight or height and some other components. You'll seldom find even things controlled in terms of alcohol and caffeine and cigarettes, unless they were completely cogent in terms of this research. And you'll find data that's all over the place. And consciousness research, the attempted rigor, is astonishing. So we can't say even more than average. Let's not under-exaggerate this. This is fundamental in terms of research, this whole component of presentiment where things might happen or be registered just fractions of a second or seconds before events, or precognition in terms of foreknowledge in its broader framelwork.
And the presentiment research is typically biological in
very much
nature.
Biological in
they're
nature.
looking at galvanic skin response or EEGs in the brain and showing that the body is responding to a stimulus in advance of the presentation of that stimulus.
Exactly. And again, we say, wait a minute, where does this all fit in? And precognition, in a way, is an extension for knowledge because it might be quite a distance ahead. And then we have these protocols, like, for example, with Rupert Sheldrake, in terms of staring. And where
The
does that
sensation of being stared at.
Yes.
Where, again, physiological measurements are made of a person. You get this feeling sometimes in the back of your neck when you know someone's staring at you. But in this case, the staring might be done via closed-circuit video system, and you don't know when you're being stared at.
Exactly. So it's very, very controlled. Again, all of these are demonstrating 1 in 1 billion against chance, 1 in 10 to the 9 against chance. These are all Six Sigma data. And then, of course, we spoke about survival after bodily death. And when you start looking at these analyses in detail, taking even one case sometimes, such as the alleged Maroczy-Korchnoi chess game. You find that
about which we've done an entire interview
Right.
that people can find when they look at the listings for these video interviews.
You find that the data there is, again, 1 in a billion against chance. Now, could it be, because we're talking about mechanisms here, could it be that all of these have similar mechanisms, or do we have to explain every one of them differently? And it's a problem, because if we have to explain every one of them differently, one can have people who say, oh, well, this is all junk, so what? What's the mechanism? Yeah. You've got to try and find some kind of common causal thread.
Now, Vernon, I have attended conferences of consciousness researchers, and the conventional researchers who are open to even listening to this data, and some are not, but they often say, well, this is very interesting, but before we can begin to come up with a mechanism for psi, we first have to understand consciousness, because we don't understand consciousness yet. I think they have it backwards. I think that they're not going to understand consciousness until they understand psi. What do you think?
I agree with you in a way. I think that the beauty about psi research, and this includes another of the 9 protocols, for example, ganzfeld phenomena.
That's another one, which is an outgrowth of the original dream telepathy experiments. In other words, people are put into a state of sensory isolation and are asked to perform simple clairvoyant tasks. And this research has been repeated well over a dozen laboratories with very significant meta-analyses, again showing a 6 sigma deviation from chance.
Right. And the beauty of all of these 9 different areas is if you can apply a mechanism. But your question really related to, well, can they understand the consciousness without it? Well, it's like going along and looking at the mint. Now, if you have a mint, it might presuppose having a dollar in that mint. Yeah. And if you can find just a single dollar, you could argue that it was minted by, you don't know what this mint means, but it was minted by something.
There must be a mint somewhere.
There must be a mint somewhere. Yeah. Now, if you find 9 different, supposedly separate areas with a common theme of 6 sigma protocols, 1 in a billion against chance each time.
And the common theme, though, is about consciousness. Each of these studies says something about consciousness operating in a way that transcends our normal understanding of time and space, matter and energy, and the brain.
And our sensory apparatus as we know it, and our motor apparatus as we know it. Yes. And this is the common theme there. If you've got that dollar in the mint, and we've got 9 different lots of dollars there, we've got to say, wait a minute, this thing exists. Is there a common theme? And indeed, there is a common mechanism as I see it.
And you've done a lot of thinking. We should let our viewers know that you've really developed a whole new paradigm for looking at these phenomena.
Exactly that. In my book, Reality Begins with Consciousness, a paradigm shift that works. I wrote this with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Edward Close, a mathematician and physicist, a very, very creative individual in that regard. And we wrote this, and our ideas kept changing, not changing in terms of fundamentals, but growing. And the whole idea kept growing bigger and bigger. And it went to 5 editions and 6 revisions, and then we started publishing all sorts of extra papers in this. So it's been something that has encompassed a lot of my thinking, the whole area of consciousness. And finally, recently, we wrote a paper on the mechanisms of psi, how in the simple form, psi obviously refers to basic things on the afferent side and the incoming side, so-called extrasensory perception, which might be a misnomer, but we just are saying those areas that don't cover the conventional sensory components, and psychokinesis, which again might be a misnomer, but on the motoric side, the efferent side, beyond the usual muscles.
Mind over matter.
Mind over matter, and probably something central in between.
Because just for a second, Vernon, the very fact that I can raise my finger or two fingers when I choose according to my mind, that's mind over matter right there in the body.
That is mind over matter. And this is the beauty about it, because we can come along and say, this is pure physiology, this is pure brain, and with the nervous system and the connections and everything goes there. Or we can say, hold on, because all of this has happened, and because we can stimulate areas of the brain and produce certain responses, doesn't mean to say that we necessarily have the whole picture, that we have the whole picture of why that toe is moving, why everything is happening, and we can extend this. So I started saying to myself, is there a commonality, a common thread in terms of consciousness?
Yes.
And we developed this model, strange name. It's called Triadic Dimensional Distinction Vortical Paradigm. Don't worry about remembering that. We abbreviate it to TDVP.
Yeah.
But the most important component of this is that we're dealing with a multitude of different dimensions, not only what we can see and hear. In other words, not only is what is overt, but what is covert. And the most important component is everything is busy spinning and spinning in vertically and moving in that regard. And it's a whole new paradigm shift. These are rotating dimensions from that first dimension to the ninth dimension. And these extend all the way through to the infinite. So now where does this fit into the idea that I'm talking about in terms of mechanisms of psi? Well, the reason why it fits in is this theory, TDVP, has grown and grown. It's more than a theory, it's a paradigm. And within it, we can explain psi. And as you said, once psi is busy occurring, a lot of stuff gets thrown out the window, because we can't just say we are three little space components of space, height and length and width in a moment in time. We are far, far more. We cannot just say that mass and energy are just, that's all there is. And if there's a little bit of consciousness, it's incorporated there.
Alan Watts once used the term skin-encapsulated ego.
Very nice term, too.
Yeah. And you're saying we're much more than that.
We're much more than that. So how can we prove it? So if we use this model, we suddenly start explaining all sorts of things. Because if you're starting to look in terms of different dimensions and vertical rotations and rotations across, you can climb up and go far beyond what one really is experiencing. So people have started to use a term that physicists like, called non-locality. And they like it sometimes in terms of a physics phenomenon called entanglement, where the one component talks to the other over time and space.
Instantaneously across vast distances, one might say faster than the speed of light.
Right. And here is the part that is interesting, because you use that word instantaneous. And that term instantaneous in terms of time might be instantaneous in terms of our time as we know it, our linear time. But if you have multidimensional time, or if you are moving across different dimensions, you suddenly are able to explain stuff that you cannot explain within our limited paradigm. It doesn't mean to say that all of physics is wrong. None of the physics is wrong, because 3 dimensions of space in a moment in time, most of our physical theories all still fit into a 9-dimensional paradigm because 9 spinning dimensions contains that 3S1T, those components. But suddenly, the aspects that we cannot easily explain, the conundrums that we can't easily try to solve using that limited perspective, suddenly starts to make sense. And suddenly we can grow from there. So we can move upwards across individual dimensions. We use a term called intervention. Individual dimensions. I've had to develop, Dr. Close and I had to develop a whole new vocabulary in this area which we call dimensional biopsychophysics. And this is one of them. This movement across dimensions, between dimensions, and also inside. So we can have somebody who's biological and psychological and sociological and cultural. We can talk about biopsychosociocultural, but within this 3S1T. But imagine if you go much higher.
3S1T meaning three dimensions of space and one of time.
And one in time, one tiny t, because it's just the only thing we have is the present.
But your 9 dimensions include multiple dimensions of time and of consciousness.
We think, you see, we can prove, and this is where we've got to differentiate, we can prove mathematically that there are 9 finite dimensions. But we cannot necessarily prove that those 9 finite dimensions consist of 3 of space, 3 of time, and 3 of consciousness. There is some mathematical support for this, and we think this is so, but we think this is simplistic. You see, by the time you get up to the level of the infinite, where the 9 dimensions are contained within the infinite, maybe all of that is consciousness, and all of space and time is incorporated within the infinite.
Would it be fair to say that what you're doing is taking some of the great ethno-historical, mystical traditions that have looked at this notion of consciousness as multidimensional, Kabbalah or the Vedas or shamanistic traditions, and you're integrating it with a contemporary knowledge of physics and mathematics and Psi research?
It is fair, because Psi research is so important, because if Psi exists, and we've said there are 9 different cogent reasons why it exists in terms of statistical existence, okay? And if our experience, our daily experience exists, and as far as I'm concerned, that's just as cogent, because I can say none of it exists. The only thing that exists is me. Everything is imaginary.
Solipsism.
Yeah, but there's a problem with that. The problem is simply that if only I exist and everything is imaginary, I would have to be a divinity. As far as I'm concerned, look at this, look what I have created. Now, personally, I know I'm not the divinity, which means that this whole solipsistic attitude, this whole component is wrong. And if that's wrong, I have to establish why Psi on the one side exists, which might be in part non-local, because it's going beyond space and time. And I call the term relatively non-local because it's relative to the different dimensions that occur. And Psi exists, which might also be local because it hits the brain, the living brain, but what happens with survival where there's no living brain? When one looks at this, how do you adapt this? Now, the way you adapt is you start looking at these rotations across different dimensions, this intervention, this movement across dimensions, but between different let us say social systems, psychological and everything. Every one of these impact. And if you look at this as an explanation in terms of these vortical rotations, I use this funny phrase, a vortical intervention, which just means you're dealing with rotational movements. Suddenly, you find that every single Psi phenomenon can be explained, and we can even explain problems pertaining to not only quantum entanglement, but even these fundamental ideas that are incorporated broadly in physics, and we won't go into detail, it's too complex, called the Copenhagen interpretation of physics, and there are like 19 different variants of this. You can explain this upstream. The important component here is to understand a box. We're in a little box, which is our reality in 3S1T.
Three dimensions of space and one of time. That's our box.
That's our box. We go outside that box and we can see inside that box.
Yeah.
You know, it's like on a clear day you can see forever in a strange kind of way. This is what Psi is doing for us in different kinds of ways. There is this escape phenomenon whereby suddenly time, which is linear, well, we can't explain this. How can we explain things that seem to be instantaneous? How can we explain things that seem to be not only be instantaneous in time, but completely separated in terms of space? It doesn't make sense. But suddenly it makes sense when you go higher at a different level. And this is what this whole vortical intervention mechanism is all about. Don't get frightened by these terms. There's a whole glossary. You know, if you are in medicine and you're talking to somebody not in medicine, you can read a whole group of words or phrases. I wrote a book called Innovative Psychopharmacotherapy. It's gobbledygook for ordinary people, but doctors read it, it's completely comprehensible. Pharmacologists read it, it's comprehensible. So we have these different terms that we've had to develop in this discipline of dimensional biopsychophysics, one of which is vortical intervention. But when you start moving across, suddenly you say, hold on, I can explain how when two events are happening separate in time and space, well, if you go outside the box and you can keep going higher and higher outside the box, it fits. Ultimately, you get to the infinite, and there's a difference between the infinite and the finite.
Well, Vernon Neppe, Dr. Neppe, what an exciting discussion this has been. It's been not only informative, but it's really been stimulating. My imagination is working full speed now. Thank you so much for being with me.
It's a full speed imagination, and that difference between the finite, which is quantized, which is consisting of little pixels like a TV screen, and we cannot experience that infinite, which is continuous. All of these are all linked up into one unit. And until we begin to understand the one unit of Psi being proven by Six Sigma data, not only in the lab, but spontaneous Psi, we shouldn't ignore it. And on the other side, our ordinary existence, and the fact that we can reconcile these by just moving upwards, outside dimensions, spinning dimensions, we suddenly don't fully realize how much we can reconcile, and we can reconcile it all. So thank you so much, Jeff.
Well, I have to think that our viewers are also thanking you right now as well, because if I'm stimulated, I'm sure so are they. And on behalf of both of us, you and me, let me say thank you for being with us.